All right, so we are picking back up with our study now with Lesson 8 as we begin really, in my mind, making application to the things that we've discussed. The first 6 lessons were really kind of foundational. Lesson 7, we really talked about the responsibility of the church. And Lesson 8, we tie in now the individual Christian as we kind of combine talking about the responsibilities of the church versus the responsibilities of the individual Christian. And just from my personal experience in studying through various issues within the church and studying with various brethren, this is the primary argument that has been made to me personally as far as taking or believing that they have authority to do things for which the church has no authority to do. So it's a big one where we get confused. People get confused on this idea of, well, why can't the church do it if the individual Christian can do? So we'll start talking about that this evening. New memory verse, 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 11. Whoever speaks is to do so as the one who is speaking the utterances of God. Whoever serves is to do so as one who is serving by the strength which God supplies, so that in all things God may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom belongs the glory and dominion forever and ever. Amen. And that is the New American Standard edition there. So 1 Peter 4, verse 11. Again, authority, the power of one whose will and commands must be obeyed by others. So when we start talking about the idea of church responsibility versus individual Christian responsibility, there are a couple of things that Cookeville notes as far as modern theories in regards to issues that arise from that. What the Christian individual can do, the church can do. And this is one that, again, I personally have heard. The other one is what the church cannot do, the Christian individual cannot do. So they're pretty well just kind of lumped together. One of the things that I've heard is because the church is made up of individuals, and whatever the individual can do or whatever the individual is doing, then the church can do it. And that's their authority. Well, as Christians, we can do this, and so the church has the authority to do this thing. I really like what Rule Lemons said in 1960, and this kind of just gives you an idea. This argument has been made for a very long time. He says, it seems to us that one and only real principle underlying all the issues of our present time is that of church action versus individual action. We believe that if this one principle could be resolved, the issues, all of them would disappear. We repeatedly hear the slogan voiced that anything the individual can do, the church can do. We do not believe it. We believe that there are certain things an individual can do and has an obligation to do and that the church cannot do. The very fact that the Lord provided for an organism called the church is proof positive that it has some function peculiar to itself. If there were no functions peculiar to the church, it would be non-essential. There would be no need for it if other capacities could provide all the functions of which it is capable. And this is something that we probably still have some issues, but there'd be a lot of issues that would go away if we could understand just this one concept as far as the difference between the individual Christian and the church in regards to the responsibilities that we have. So when you start looking at God-ordained institutions that we as individual Christians have a responsibility toward, the first one we're going to start with is the government. Turn over to Romans chapter 13. And we're not going to look at passages in regards to all of the institutions that we're going to talk about, but this one I think it's important for us for multiple reasons. One is just a way of reminder that we do have a responsibility toward the government. Romans chapter 13, and we'll start over here with Gil. Gil, if you'll read 1 through 3, and then Sam 4 through 7, please.
Let every soul be subject to the governing authority, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring justice upon themselves. For rulers are not of terror to the word, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of authority? Do unto it, and you will have praise for your thanks. For if you serve God, you do for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid. For it is not fair that rules are nothing. For authority and goodness of God, devoting himself to ministry rendered to all those who do them, tax-giving tax-giving, custom-giving custom, spirit-giving spirit, honor-giving honor.
So I think it's very evident that we have a responsibility toward the government, to be in subjection to the government. And I love this passage with all this talk about authority. And I mentioned before, I think that part of the issue that we have within society is we have a lack of respect for authority in general, especially with our children nowadays. It seems like more so with school. But we have our government officials, the authority figures set up, and we are to be in subjection to them, and we owe them that. Turn over to 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2. Double checking. I think my notes didn't match the slide. I was trying to figure out which one was correct. 1 Peter 2:13 through 17. Drew, if you would read 13 through 15, and then Marissa 16 and 17.
Therefore, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme, or the governors as those who are sent by him. For the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, and by doing good, you may put the balance to increase of good.
Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants in bondage. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the emperor.
So as individual Christians within the country, within the state, within the county, within the city, we have a responsibility to adhere to the laws that have been set up for us by the government. We are in subjection to the government. So that is a God-ordained institution that we have a responsibility toward. We recognize and we know that we have a responsibility toward the home and the family. We're not going to turn to these passages. We've looked at them several times. We know the responsibilities that we have as husbands, responsibility that we have as wives, as fathers, as mothers, even as children, the responsibilities that we have there. And so we have these responsibilities that we have to provide, to train, to love, to honor, to be in subjection to, depending upon which side of the equation you're on as far as the husband or the wife. And this is a God-ordained institution that as individual Christians we have a responsibility toward. We know that we have a responsibility toward the church. And obviously we talked about that in Lesson 7 quite a bit. And I'll reiterate the one statement that Reuel Lemons made in the article that we read from. He says, the very fact that the Lord provided an organism called the church is proof positive that it has some function peculiar to itself. And that's really a key point to understand as we go throughout this lesson, because if there was no peculiar function that the church had to perform, then there would be no need for it, because individual Christians just would perform those things. But God provided us the church. We have a responsibility to the church as another God-ordained institution. And this is something that comes from Roy Cogdell's book that I think helps us to understand the responsibility. And I like the fact that he's got everything surrounded by this Christianity circle. And so it's all encompassing. So as we live a Christian life, we have a responsibility toward all of these things, toward the government, toward the home and our family relationships, toward the church, also toward our community, various social relationships that we will have, also with our work. We have responsibilities with these things, but at no time, at no point within our lives can we step back and say, okay, well, I don't have to worry about being a Christian right now because I'm at work. Or I don't have to worry about being a Christian right now because, well, I'm with some friends out town, so, it's not really necessary. No, being a Christian is and should be our way of life. It is the life that we lead 24/7, regardless of where we are at. And it's interesting in Cogdell's book, Walking by Faith, when he's talking about this here. He says it's just as necessary for a Christian to please God and do His will in his relationship to the government, in the home, in the conduct of his business, and in his social contact with his fellow man as it is in the church. And we talk about how, it's so easy for us as Christians when we're within these four walls to act like a Christian because we're surrounded by other Christians, but that doesn't mean that when we leave these four walls, we don't have to worry about living as a Christian. And so when we're talking about the responsibilities that we have as an individual Christian, we have responsibilities in all of these different areas, and we are to be fulfilling these responsibilities at all times as we live the Christian life. So when we start looking then at differences that we see within the New Testament with the individual Christian versus the church, we should understand that church action involves a group of individual Christians acting collectively. So when we come together as a church, obviously we are a group of individual Christians that have joined ourselves together collectively. And go ahead and turn over to Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 16. And so when we think about the work of the church, which we talked about in Lesson 7, it becomes the responsibility of every member. It is something that we should all be participating in. Jeff, if you could read Ephesians 4:16 for us, please. Jeff Sharp. The New American Standard talks about as which every joint supplies. It's work that is done by all of its members collectively. So we're all working in conjunction with one another, in connection with one another. We're working collectively as individual Christians, but we are acting as the church. We also need to understand that when we're acting collectively as a church, one member, one part of the body is not the church. Turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 12. Andy, you want to go ahead and read it for us, please?
For as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of that one body, and many are one body, so also is Christ.
So we're one body, but it's not comprised of one member. Romans chapter 12. Go ahead and read that in Romans chapter 12. Beginning in verse 4, it says, "For just as we have many members in one body, and all the members do not have the same function, so we who are many are one body in Christ, and individually members one of another. Since we have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, each of us is to exercise them accordingly. If prophecy, according to the proportion of his faith; if service, in his serving; or he who teaches, in his teaching; or one who exhorts in his exhortation; he who gives with liberality; he who leads with diligence; he who shows mercy with cheerfulness." So we understand again, we're one body, but we're individual members that come together as this body. And so when we're talking about the church, it is comparable to the flock or a herd. It is a collective noun. And yeah, I would laugh too if I was up here trying to teach English to somebody. Zoe asked me just the other day, what was your best subject? Not English. But it is a collective noun. We understand the idea of a flock. We understand the idea of a herd. And when we're talking about a flock, one sheep does not make up the flock. And I think that it makes it a lot easier to see when we see these various instances within the New Testament. So go ahead and turn over to Matthew chapter 18. And I think that the distinction is made very clear. This is one of the passages, I'll say, that I think it is made very clear whenever we're talking about the individual Christian versus the church. So in Matthew chapter 18, beginning in verse 15, it says, "If your brother sins, go and show him his fault in private. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. But if he does not listen to you, take one or two more with you, so that by the mouth of two or three witnesses every fact may be confirmed. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. So when we talk about this idea of a collective noun in regards to the church, which in the singular form denotes a collection of individuals. You can think about an army, an orchestra, or a crowd. It's treated as singular whenever the collection is thought of as a whole, and plural when the individual members are thought of as acting separately. Now, to help kind of explain this, because it makes it a lot easier for me to understand when I see it kind of laid out. So we can see the singular noun, the plural noun, and then the collective noun. Just like we see with when you talk about a chain. Well, a chain is comprised of individual links, but individual links don't necessarily make up a chain. But we can see the link as the singular noun, links as the plural noun, and the chain as the collective noun. And so a single unit of a collective noun is not the same thing as the collective. Let me say that again. A single unit of a collective noun is not the same thing as the collective. And again, I think that we all understand that, how just because you've got a link or even a bunch of links, if they're not all tied together, doesn't mean that you have a chain. Just because you've got a soldier, you don't have an army. And we understand that in regards to these things. Likewise, the plurality of units is not the same thing as the collective. So just because, again, you've got multiple links doesn't mean that you have a chain. And just because you might have, we've got Norm A and Norm P here. We've got more than one soldier. We don't have an army. So just because you've got more than one soldier doesn't mean that you have an army. Again, we understand that. So when we're talking about Matthew chapter 18 and verse 15, you've got the singular noun, Christian, in verse 15. If your brother sins against him, then you go to your brother and you have a conversation with him. Well, then if that doesn't work, well, then we move to the plural noun, Christians, because it's not just, you got to take 2 or 3 with you. So now you've got a group of Christians, but you still don't have the church. So verse 15, you go and talk to them yourself. That don't work. Verse 16, you take some with you. And then, okay, if that don't work, guess what? Now we bring the church into it. Verse 17. And so verse 15 shows a single Christian acting. Verse 16 shows a plurality of Christians acting, not the church, just a plurality of Christians. And then verse 17, now you have the church involved whenever the efforts of verse 16 have failed. So a clear distinction between the Christian, even Christians, and the local church. And again, I think that it helps us to understand, okay, there is a distinction, and we have to respect that whenever we're talking about the singular or the plural or the collective. So again, the single Christian that's acting in Matthew 15 was not the same thing as the church that's acting in verse 17 or called to action in verse 17. So just because the individual Christian may be authorized to act in some capacity, it does not automatically follow then that the local church may do so. That's not what we see within the New Testament. Ken, you got your hand up? Go ahead.
I guess the question might be asked, at what point does a group of Christians become Christians?
And we'll get to that question. Obviously, and I think I even have it somewhere, one person does not comprise a church. We see in Acts chapter 8, the Ethiopian eunuch, he was not a church in and of himself. And I think that, I really don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but I do want to make this comment. I think that sometimes we get confused, or I shouldn't say confused, but sometimes I think we misunderstand the passage where 2 or 3 are gathered together. Okay, well, that's just a group of Christians, and some people will try to justify doing things as a church in that situation. Well, you're not a church. 2 or 3 have gathered together, but when you have come together as a church, like in this situation here at the Jere Whitson Rd, however long ago, I guess it was in the 50s whenever it was started, a group of Christians came together and said, we're going to establish a church at this location, and this is the time that we're going to meet. And so a church has been established. But if you're on vacation and you're on vacation with, well, I've got some Christians from one place and some Christians from another place, you didn't just establish yourself a church. And so there is a difference there. and we have to respect that. Go ahead, Sam. Absolutely. No, I mean, I'll give just firsthand experience. Over in Moldova, there's not a lot of Christians, and so the churches that have been established are very, very small. I mean, we're talking just a handful of people, and one of them was just women that had joined themselves together. So, no, but you understand what I'm saying is when you go on vacation and you're meeting and you got some other Christians that have gone on vacation too, and you're out in the middle of nowhere, well, hey, we're a church, so we can perform all of the things that a church should perform. No, you're not a church. You are a group of Christians that's come together, but you are not a church. Did somebody else have their hand up? So I think that we, hopefully from this situation, we understand the difference between the church and the Christian individual from this particular passage. There's another one that I think really helps us to understand this. Go ahead and turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. We're just going to look at this real quick before we get into the Acts. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, we see a distinction being shown here, really in the eating of a meal. Papa John, if you would read verse 22, and then Jeff Scantlin, if you would read 33 and 34, please. So again, there's this distinction of eating of the meal. So there's a difference between the church coming together and partaking of the Lord's Supper meal and a common meal that an individual would eat at their home. And I think whenever we look over at Acts chapter 5, the question of a distinction in the responsibilities of the work of the local church and the individual Christian, I think that it helps us by understanding the distinction really in what I'll say the individual's money and the church's money. So over in Acts chapter 5, and I think that this is a story that we're all familiar with Ananias and Sapphira. And we'll go ahead and come back up front here. Bonnie, if you would read Acts 5, 1 through 4.
But a man named Ananias and his wife Sapphira sold a piece of property and kept back some of the price for himself, with his wife's full knowledge. And bringing a portion of it, he laid it at the apostles' feet. But Peter said, Ananias, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit, and to keep back some of the price of the land? While it remained unsold, did it not remain your own? And after it was sold, was it not under your control? Why is it that you have conceived this deed in your heart? You have not lied to men, but to God.
So Ananias is condemned because he lied to God about the money that he had laid at the apostles' feet. So it has a change of hands right there. In verse 4, Peter was very clear, while it remained, was it not your own? And after it was sold, was it not in your control? It's yours. It's under your control. You still owned it at that point. So Peter was simply trying to tell Ananias that this land, this money, it was under his control to use as he saw fit at that point. Before the land was sold, it was under his responsibility as an individual to determine what's best, going to be the best use of that. And even after he had sold the land, Ananias and Sapphira, they had complete control. They had complete authority over that money to do with what they wanted to do. So they could have made the decision not to have given it all to the Lord, just given part of it. And so the point that we see here, I really think is it's established by the fact that it was still under his control, again, before he laid it at the apostles' feet, or, in other words, when it was given to the treasury, the Lord's treasury. And so, as an individual Christian, he could have decided, you know what, I do want to give some of this money. I've sold this land. I want to give some of the money to the church, but I really need a new horse and buggy, so I'm going to buy me a new horse and buggy. Okay, that's fine. But the fact of that he lied, saying that he had given all of it, now, when it changes hands, now when he lays it at the apostles' feet, now he doesn't get to determine, well, what's the best use of that money, unless he's one of the ones in a leadership role of the church in that situation. So there's a distinction made. While it was unsold, it's yours. Even after you sold it, before you gave it at the apostles' feet, it's still yours. Now, it's not. So we see a distinction made there between the money and who is really controlling the money. This was some comments from Roger Hillis's books to try to help understand, again, the difference, the contrast. He says, I'm a member of a family. I am one of several members. What I do, either good or bad, reflects on that family. But as an individual, I am not a family. A family, by its very nature, requires more than one person. One person is not a family. And this is something that obviously we can understand the influence that we might have on a particular congregation or a particular church, or even our family. Our families can get a bad name because of the black sheep of the family, right? But just because you've got a black sheep doesn't then mean that the whole family is bad, because one person is not the family. He goes on to say, I'm a member of a nation. I am one of several citizens. What I do, either good or bad, reflects on that country. But as an individual citizen, I am not a nation. A nation, by its very nature, requires more than one citizen. One citizen is not a nation. And, of course, we understand how we can reflect poorly on the country, depending upon how we act. Likewise, he goes on to say, as a Christian, I'm a member of the family of God. I'm a citizen in the kingdom. I am only one of several members or citizens. What I do, good or bad, reflects on that family or kingdom. But as an individual, I am not the church. The church, by its very nature, requires more than one member. One Christian is not a church. And so, again, this is something that we clearly understand from every other aspect of our lives. But yet, whenever it comes to religion, then people want to use it as an excuse to do whatever they want to do because, well, the individual and the church can do the same thing. All right, so when we talk about responsibilities that are given to the individual Christian and the church, obviously we talked about the worship of God and the work for God in Lesson 7. And so the very first thing we talked about was the work of evangelism. And we talked about the fact that this is the mission that, or this is one of the things that Jesus came for. The reason he came was to seek and to save the lost. And so we talked about the fact that as a church, we likewise should carry on that mission. Well, this does not rule out the responsibility of individual Christians from evangelism. So the emphasis of spreading the gospel in the New Testament, it really is given to individuals. Mark chapter 16 and verse 15. And we have multiple examples of individual Christians acting or actively involved in evangelism. So just because, and see, this is another key aspect of this, because as individual Christians, oftentimes people will say, well, that's the church's responsibility. I don't really have to do anything. The church is going to take care of that. Well, it's the church's job to save the lost, to preach and to teach. So, you know, as long as we got Jesse here and Jesse's doing that, I don't have to worry about it. No, that's the wrong attitude. We as individual Christians have a responsibility to teach and to preach. We see examples in the New Testament where people were involved in private teaching, and we have situations where evangelists are going out on their own volition and teaching and preaching. And so souls are saved when individual Christians do their part in fulfilling the responsibility that we have as individual Christians to teach the gospel, and we can't put all the responsibility on the church. And so there's a responsibility both to the church and to individual Christians whenever we talk about evangelism and the work of benevolence. So we talked about this with lesson number 7. And this was, as we mentioned, it's a secondary work of the church, because our primary goal is to save souls and to keep souls saved through evangelism and through edification. So that's the primary mission that we have. Secondary to that, we have to provide for the needs of our brethren, and sometimes that means providing for their physical needs. And we pointed out the fact that with every New Testament passage that we have, that we see talking about church benevolence, it is in regards to giving that to brethren, giving that to saints, and only in that situation. So, what about whenever we talk about the individual Christian, the responsibility that the individual Christian has in regards to benevolence? So we refer to the benevolence that is to be involved with the church as limited. Well, the work that the individual Christian is to be partaking in regards to benevolence is more general. And so over in Luke chapter 10, we see that, and what's this a story of? So we see the story of the Good Samaritan. We recognize that we have a responsibility to our neighbor. That means the guy right next door, right? Now we have a responsibility to provide for the needs of all of mankind, anyone that has need. And we have this same principle that is taught elsewhere. That we see that in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 28. We also see that we have a responsibility to the fatherless, to the widows, over in James chapter 1 in verse 27. And we'll get into a great level of detail on a couple of these passages whenever we start talking about some of the specific issues that have arisen in the church. And this is one of them that we'll really spend a lot of time talking about. But within the context of James chapter 1 verse 27, it's all individual action. And so as individual Christians, we have a responsibility toward the fatherless and the widows. If you'll note the last phrase of verse 27, to keep himself or oneself unspotted from the world. And so as individual Christians, we have a responsibility toward that. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10, we have a responsibility toward brethren, first and foremost, but then also toward all men. And we are to be doing good, providing benevolence toward all men. And this is another passage that we'll really go into to great detail in discussing whenever we start talking about, again, some of the particular issues. So we have a responsibility to all men in this situation. Go ahead and turn over to 1 Timothy chapter 5. And we've already talked, or at least highlighted, the fact that we have a responsibility as individual Christians toward our family. And this is another one of those passages that when we're trying to help someone understand that there is clearly a distinction between the individual Christian and the church, this is a passage that you can write down on your list to be able to go to. So in 1 Timothy chapter 5, I'll read verse 4 first. It says, "But if any widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family and to make some return to their parents, for this is acceptable in the sight of God." And then moving on to verse 8, it says, "But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." And then finally in verse 16, "If any woman who is a believer who has dependent widows, she must assist them, and the church must not be burdened, so that it may assist those who are widows indeed." And Brother David Dan, he points this out in a lesson that he taught called The Church. He says, "The Bible makes a clear distinction between the church and the individual. The fact that the church and the individual are not always given the same responsibility is clearly seen in Paul's warning against the possibility that irresponsible Christians might cast their duty to care for their widowed relatives onto the church." So we see, as Christians, we are to provide for our families. That's our responsibility. Now, there might come a situation where the church is called and needed to take care of those that are in need, in particular maybe a widow of a church that has no family. But one of the things that we see is even within that situation, there are criteria that have to be met before the church is going to take on that responsibility. But first is to the family. And individual Christians have that responsibility to make sure that they are providing for those of their own house. And it's clearly stated there in verse 16, so that the church may not be burdened. And so again, there's a clear distinction made between the individual Christian and the church. And then in Matthew chapter 25, whenever we think about the judgment day, we as a church, we're not going to stand before God as a church and have to answer. We're going to stand before God as individual Christians and be judged by our actions. And we're not going to be saved on the efforts of the church. I'm not going to be saved on the efforts of Brother Ray or Sister Shirley. I'm going to be saved or lost on my own actions. Sam? Both. So, if I understand, so the responsibility that we have, yes, is to go out into the world and to bring others. Now, we have situations where the church acting as a group, like we will do, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, where we might do door knocking or some effort, as a church, where we're going to go out and try and bring people in. Obviously, you have a responsibility at school. I have a responsibility at work or wherever we might be as individual Christians. And in that situation, I'm not acting as the church. I'm acting as an individual Christian. But our job is to uphold the truth, to spread the truth, and then I think one of the things that I had said is we have to save souls, but then we have to keep them saved. And so that's where the edification comes in. So yes, we have to bring them in from the world, bring them into the church, but then once we have them in a saved condition, then we have to make sure that we are doing what we can to keep them saved. So it's a responsibility that everyone has, we as a church as well. Go ahead, Jesse.
So Paul said, 1 Timothy 3:15, the church is the pillar and ground of truth. Ephesians chapter 3, 10, 11 says the church is to make known the manifold wisdom of God. And a specific example of the local church saying, Thessalonica is spreading the gospel. 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 8, Paul says, for from you, writing to the church as a whole, for from you the word of the Lord has sounded forth, not only in Macedonia and Achaia, but also in every place your faith toward God has gone out, so that we can understand. Christians, but collectively, Paul is commending the church to spread the gospel everywhere.
And one of the ways that we have done that in the past is a gospel meeting. So yes, we're having a gospel meeting here, but the intent and the idea behind it is, as members, we're all going to go out and invite people from the community to bring them in, and that effort is designed to preach the gospel to those that need to hear it, while also strengthening the local congregation as well. Norm?
Another example may be something like if we decided to do a newspaper article or something that we collectively as a church here decide we're going to put our efforts and money into this particular way, maybe a radio program, answer questions. Now, the people that are directly involved in the production of that are who's answering the questions, etc. Or individual Christians working and doing what they can as part of the body, but it's the body in that particular case that is collectively put efforts into one thing. So it's a combination of things. We as individuals have the responsibility to go to the world and influence them to somehow be able to
And we didn't talk about this idea of edification, which is a responsibility of the church. But we also, as individual Christians, should be edifying one another and encouraging one another. Jesse, did you have your hand up again? Okay. Anybody else have a comment? All right, so I guess we're going to end on this. We won't get all the way through it, but we have responsibilities that we are to be involved with as individual Christians, that the church is also to be involved with. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, if you turn over there, I know that it's very clear that there are certain responsibilities that have been given to individual Christians that the church simply cannot fulfill. Again, I think this just helps to bolster the idea that, okay, one is not the same. Just because an individual Christian is called to do something or is doing something does not thereby give authority to the church to do so. So 1 Corinthians chapter 7, in verse 3, it says, "The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does." So we clearly see the instructions given to both husbands and wife in regards to the sexual relationship. And that's the responsibility of husbands and wives. It's not the responsibility of the church to love my wife. It's not the responsibility of the church to love someone's husband. And people might be thinking, well, that's just crazy. Yeah, it is. We'll pick up with responsibilities of the Christian individual that the church cannot fulfill next week, and we'll get into the questions. So if you don't have a copy of those, there are still some in the back, and they're on the OneDrive and been emailed out as well. Thanks, everybody.